Welcome. I'll be introducing Joline and Karla, who everyone really knows anyway. They went on a learning tour exploring legacies of war to Laos and Vietnam. I have an interest. I grew up in the 60s and the early 70s when the Vietnam War was sort of winding down. And I remember I lived very close to the U.S. border. And so we got the body count every night on the evening news. And I remember that very vividly. My wife and I worked with Indo-Chinese refugees from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia in the early 1980s. So in 1975, all three countries were either liberated or fell, depending on your politics, into a communist regime. And MCC was one of the only organizations, along with the Quakers, who stayed within those communist countries. And it was very divisive within the MCC community whether you should work with a partner known as the Communist Government of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So MCC has had a long history, and my wife and I and 4 children during a sabbatical went to Vietnam, and so we lived in Hanoi, where my wife did interim country rep work, and I hung out in Hanoi, going all over the place with my kids, going to museums, going to Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum, which you guys went to? Very creepy. Anyway, welcome, and I look forward to hearing what Karla and Joline have to say today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Fred. Normally I'm a bit unscripted, but because we're working as a team, we had to make sure that we know what each of us is talking about. So if I'm a little off topic, that's why. Sabadi. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this lunch and listen session focusing on legacy of war. We recently had the privilege of representing MCC while visiting partner organizations in Vietnam and Laos. As a delegate of 7 people from various points in North America, 5 Americans and 2 Canadians, we traveled from different regions to see firsthand how MCC is working in the areas of relief, development, and peace, mostly in response to the lingering effects of war. Wendy Martin, an MCC rep for Laos for the past 10 years, has just returned and has been speaking in various places, including the Peace Conference, about MCC's work there. Since we have such short time this afternoon, we decided to focus this lunch and listen session particularly on Vietnam. We will do our best to share our reflections and learnings in hope you ponder the global role that we play as Christians, probably economically privileged Christians, in a world full of conflict and war. We discuss, believe, and pursue peace for our world, all while knowing that we deal with very little threat to ourselves on a daily basis. Vietnam and Laos have a long history of devastation from war, and Fred talked a little bit about that. There continues to be humanitarian need, which MCC has been responding to for decades. This, in addition to the fact that both are developing nations with challenges with infrastructure, political structures, lack of social programs, access to education, corruption, fair wages, and more. Depending on your age, you'll have heard of this war, but might not necessarily know the particulars of the conflict. Before our experiences as MCC representatives, we certainly placed ourselves into that category. The conflict was peaking in 1969, a few years before we were born. I know we look younger than that, but that's true. Who knew that more than 40 years later, we would be standing on the soil and hearing firsthand stories of how this war is still stealing lives today? And who knew we would meet many people about our age who had never had direct participation in the American war. Most of them were not even born during the height of the conflict, but are very much affected by it today.
So for those of you who may not be familiar with the details of the American war conflict, we will briefly touch on a few important points as they relate to the work of Mennonite Central Committee. Keep in mind, we're not history majors, nor experts in the field, just people who have visited, listened, learned, and now hope to share. The American War, or Vietnam War, was surrounded by much controversy as to whether the U.S. should have ever been there. War is complicated. Each side has their point of view. Governments for both sides worked very hard to control information and messages for the general public in order to foster support from their people. We have learned through our experience that that the perspective of war can change depending on who is narrating. Regardless of the opinion or perspective you take, there are 2 indisputable war tactics which took place, contributing to the loss of human life over the last 4 decades. Cluster munitions, landmines, UXO, or whatever term you may know them by, and Agent Orange. These might be completely foreign terms for you, and we will try to shed some light. Real people, people with families, fathers, brothers, sons, men involved in their communities and churches, decided to use these types of brute force against innocent civilians, referred to as collateral damage. Once you meet the collateral damage, your perspective changes.
So this is a map of the area that we traveled. And for those of you to get a little perspective, if this side of the world isn't your familiarity, Vietnam is here, Laos and Cambodia, I don't know how much you can see. We focused a lot of our time in the north, in Hanoi, which is where the MCC office is, and then traveled further south into Quang Ngai, which is over here. Each one of these red dots shows where where Agent Orange has been brought, and you can see the concentrations in some of the hot spots. When you see it close up, it's really disturbing to see how many spots actually make up that small space. Over 20 million gallons of this chemical was sprayed over inland and coastal forests, waterways, and agricultural areas in South Vietnam. The intent was to defoliate, so to take away the trees, the leaves, so that they could see the enemy and basically destroy crops believed to be food sources, again, for the enemy. Depends what side you're on. Some areas in South Vietnam were sprayed once. Other areas were sprayed multiple times. Some places received dumps of concentrated chemicals because planes were not allowed to come back onto an Air Force base with chemicals on board. So before they landed, they just simply dumped the entire load. Some different herbicide combinations were sprayed, and they were named according to the color that was painted on the side of the barrel. So Agent White, Agent Purple, Agent Blue, etc. But the main herbicide was Agent Orange. Spraying contributed to widespread crop destruction, both intended and unintended. While many of the field crops were expected to recover by the next planting season, fruit trees were more drastically damaged, and many would never produce again, at least for several years. Domestic animals and humans became ill or died after exposure to the herbicide sprays, or after eating herbicide-treated plants or drinking contaminated water. After it was discovered that one of Agent Orange's main chemical compounds, which is dioxin, caused birth defects in lab mice, the use of it was halted in 1970, and that was 8 years after the spraying had begun. So 20 million gallons over 8 years was already dumped, and then they decided this is bad for humans, animals, waterways, whatnot. So in 2014, the US Department of Veteran Affairs decided that they would take a stance and recognized formally 13 conditions, and these are only some of them, that are directly connected to exposure to Agent Orange. Birth defects are one of the ones that we experience quite a lot about. Next slide, please. So there was an estimated 4.8 million Vietnamese who were exposed to Agent Orange. So what does that mean in 2018? Well, there was 3 groups of people who were exposed or who continue to have health complications because of this. One are people who were directly exposed during the war, during the time of conflict. 2 are people who are mainly farmers who are still being exposed to this day because they're living in or near hotspots close to old Air Force bases where Agent Orange was stored, dumped, spilled, or repeatedly sprayed. The 3rd are children, grandchildren, and now even great-grandchildren of the people who were exposed in the first place. During our travels, we had the opportunity to meet and hear personal stories from all 3 of these groups, and we want to take a minute to share some of their stories with you.
We had the opportunity to visit the headquarters of Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin, known as VAVA, while we were in Hanoi. VAVA was started in 2003 and is a social organization of victims of Agent Orange and volunteers who help victims overcome the consequences of toxic chemicals. They advocate for the mobilization of the support and assistance in helping the victims both physically and mentally and protecting their rights and interests. MCC works primarily with VAVA to provide medical services and livelihood assistance to victims of dioxin. VAVA operates in almost every province in Vietnam with more than 360,000 members. MCC works with VAVA to provide educational support and appropriate occupational therapy to second, third, and now fourth generation affected persons. And they assist families affected by Agent Orange by training volunteers in home-based therapy activities. They collaborate with veterans peace groups to encourage international awareness and support of the victims of Agent Orange, and they advocate for US recognition of the damages caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam. We also traveled to Duc Pho, where we visited families affected by Agent Orange and receiving assistance through MCC's Cow Bank project. The Cow Bank project in Quang Ngai province provides a way for individuals affected by Agent Orange to work close to home and supplement their income. VAVA and MCC give a cow to a family or individual living with the effects of Agent Orange. As payment for their cow, the recipient gives its first calf to another household living with the effects. After the calf has been passed to that next household, the original recipient can choose what to do with their cow. Some sell it for profit immediately. Others use the cow as collateral in order to take out a loan. Some choose to breed the cow again and sell the offspring, or start a small herd of cattle. Cows are usually used for beef in this area and are a great source of income for people. In 2016, 40 cows were distributed to families affected by Agent Orange. In 2017, the number increased to 107 cows, and 21 calves had been passed on. This project continues to provide an important source of income for families. This is the Tan family, and Mr. Tan is a participant in the MCC Cow Bank program administered by VAVA. His family consists of himself, his wife, one daughter, and 2 sons. Mr. Tan served in the Army during the American War, and during this time, he was in areas that were sprayed with Agent Orange and frequently bombed. When he and other soldiers first saw the spray, they thought it looked like fog. They didn't know it was poison, but 5 or 6 days later, the trees died. In recent years, Mr. Tan began having fevers and body aches, and the government sent him to the hospital for a health check in 2002. It was then that he found out that he was affected by dioxin. He has headaches, anemia, and episodes of dizziness. Dung, one of Mr. Tan's sons, who is 29, is also affected by dioxin. And this is a picture of Dung here. And he has been mostly bedridden since birth. Mr. Tan's wife stays at home to take care of Dung in order to help him with his personal hygiene. The family faces significant financial difficulties. Mr. Tan and his wife are retired and are having more difficulty caring for their son. They receive the equivalent of about 31 Canadian dollars a month from the government, so Mr. Tan also keeps chickens for a living, and then the neighbors help them. But in 2013, when Mr. Tan received a cow from the MCC Cow Bank program, it made a difference. 2 calves have been born, and the second calf is now pregnant. And we have a video in a couple of minutes, and Mr. Tan is featured in that video, so watch for him there. This is the Lam family. In this house lives a mom, her husband, and 2 sons. The husband fixes motorbikes for a living, and the eldest son is 19 and currently in school. The youngest son is 10, and he is affected by dioxin through his paternal grandfather, who was exposed to spraying during the war. In February of 2017, he started attending the VAVA Daycare Center every day. This is an occupational therapy center that Karla will touch on in a minute. But before coming to the center, he couldn't walk downstairs. He spent a lot of time lying down at home, and he had a hard time engaging with people. For much of his life, he wasn't mobile, so his muscles were very tight. After spending time at the center, socializing and participating in therapy, he's been able to put a lot more weight on his feet, which is helpful for his overall mobility. He can walk more easily, and he responds to others with emotion. He still doesn't speak, but it's clear that he understands much more than he can express. This is the Quang family. 5 people live in this household: a mom, a dad, 2 grown children, and 1 grandchild. Mr. Quang, who is 73, was a doctor who helped soldiers during the war and served for 10 years in areas that were being sprayed by Agent Orange. In 1985, he started to have health effects through as a result of the dioxin, although he continued to work until he no longer could in 1988. Currently, he doesn't walk or move. He can't see or hear. But we had the opportunity to meet him. One of his sons, pictured here, 42, is also affected by Agent Orange and has headaches, seizures, and takes medication for nerve damage. He speaks English and was very direct about his opinions with us about the war and its effects. Mr. Kwang's wife asked us, "Why did you bring the poison here?" She said, "Something is wrong in the past, and you have to pay for your mistake. The poison has brought sorrow to the Vietnamese people and my family in particular." So we'd like to take a few minutes to share a video with you that was created by MCC, which provides some good insight into understanding how the legacy of war continues to affect the families in Vietnam.
So tough stuff. That was 2 weeks of our trip, meeting family after family who had experienced a similar story, but again, what they just wanted to do is share. They wanted someone to listen and someone to care. So this picture that you see here is Esther Buescher. She is now returned to the United States, but is still doing some work with MCC Vietnam. They were in Quang Ngai. She was a service worker and has been instrumental in guiding the therapy program in Quang Ngai province, which equips individuals with disabilities and their families to develop skills and use adaptive strategies. I should also mention there are no government-funded social structure in place to assist people that can't help themselves. The program aims for dignity and empowerment, helping those affected to take care of their own daily needs as much as possible. Goals and activities are designed for each individual, and that progress is tracked. The therapy program also seeks to help those involved to communicate, learn appropriate boundaries, and experience the acceptance and guidance of caregivers, neighbors, and friends. We learned that in the time that Esther had been working in this day center, the participants have gone from needing to be fed by others to feeding themselves, which is a huge accomplishment. The next slide is the first couple that I met, so very memorable to me. This is Mr. Dow, and he's 76 years old, suffers from numbness and paralysis in his legs. He has restricted mobility in his hands and has not been able to manually move his wheelchair at all anymore. He could get in and out of bed on his own before, but he broke his leg in 2017, and since then is confined to the wheelchair. He had enlisted in the Army when he was 24 years old and worked as a nurse during the American War. They did not take any precautions after their area was sprayed with Agent Orange. They cooked in stream water that was likely contaminated and covered themselves with twigs for camouflage since the leaves had fallen off the trees. Once they had already been exposed, they learned that the spray was poison. His wife is 70 and also, of course, lives with him, and they had a daughter who had died. They also have a 40-year-old son and his wife who live with them now along with their 2 daughters. Over time, their son has developed a lot of cognitive delays and can't work, and both of the daughters, 12 and 6, are also born with birth defects. The only income earner in the house is the daughter-in-law who works as a tailor in a sewing factory. Mr. Dow and his wife are retired, and they receive a small retirement stipend along with a stipend for dioxin exposure from the government, together equaling about $97 a month. They would like to have access to an electronic wheelchair for Mr. Dow, which means they'd have to widen the doorways, and all of that is completely outside of their reach. This family here was fun to meet. This daughter was a little monkey. Mr. Chin is 66 and suffers from open sores on his legs and has a piece of shrapnel lodged in his head. He was diagnosed in 1985 as a victim of Agent Orange and has liver inflammation, abscess of the liver, as well ongoing joint and muscle pain. He fought as a soldier in the mountains where he was exposed, and his wife was also part of the resistance army and she was exposed. They drank water, ate food, same story again and again. They have 3 children. The first 2 children are boys and were not affected at all. The third child here, who is now 30, has a lot of challenges. I'll skip through some of the detail just in the interest of time. One of the things that was interesting is before Vava Center was there, she was on her own in the community to basically fill her days. Her parents worked, and there wasn't a place for her to go, and she caused a lot of trouble in the neighborhood. So Vava Center opened. I wish I had time to tell you more. And they were able to work with her, and she has learned now to read, and she communicates well. She controls her anger better, and the community has also benefited from the improvement with this young lady herself. Their monthly allowance that they get for all of the family is 287 Canadian a month. This young family, they live in a brick and cement house, excuse me, in a very rural setting overlooking rice fields. It's lovely. A lot of poverty. Their house leaks from rain and needs a lot of repairs. Her husband was killed 2 years ago in a traffic accident, and her son here has cerebral palsy, is not able to walk, and most of the time lays in bed. She does need to leave him alone when she goes to work in the rice fields because there aren't other options for him. She receives $34 a month Canadian and was very lucky to get a cow from the MCC Cow Bank project. and has passed the first calf, which is exciting, and is waiting. The cow has been inseminated, and they're waiting for the second one, and she feels that this is a long time to wait. So that's, I can understand that. A very exciting update to this young man since our visit. There were 2 learning tours that went through in the past year, and being in their home and seeing what they have and what they don't have is very moving. And money has come forward through VAVA leadership, and they have provided this young man with a wheelchair, a proper wheelchair. And funny working in social enterprise and in stores and seeing the kind of physical aids that come through and are donated, because our government provides these things free of charge, and seeing what people are dealing with that don't have access to these things, it was just like, if we could just pack it all up and send it over, but things don't always work that easily.
So the final family we're going to tell you about is Norc's family. So 3 people live in this household. Mua, the mother, who teaches middle school physics. Nam, the father, who is an electrician, and Norc, a 6-year-old girl affected by dioxin. So Esther observed that she likely has hydrocephalus and possibly a cleft lip. So the exposure to dioxin likely happened through her paternal grandfather, but they don't fully even know how he was exposed. No one else in the family has ever been affected. During this visit, we observed home therapy, where she was having some exercises that had been going on for the past year. Before she had started home therapy, she was antisocial, and she would throw any toy that was given to her. She would throw it at someone or away. She wanted nothing to do with that. Now she not only plays with her own toys, but she interacts with the other children and plays with them as well. And she's more active and can hold things in her hands. She's developed more movement that way. Before starting therapy, she could only sit with support. Now she can sit and walk, and they've been working on moving from sitting to standing, which is exciting to see. This family receives the equivalent of about $30 a month.
So that's the end of the stories that we're going to tell you about the people we met. We could fill an entire day sharing 2 weeks of what we had experienced. I think the takeaway for me is it doesn't matter 80 all the way to born now affected, and VAVA has a logo which starts off with sort of a stick figure person in the middle, a large one, a smaller one, and a smaller one, representing the 3 generations of people who have been affected from Agent Orange, and they are now working their logo again to include a 4th body, because that chemical, the disruption in the DNA is continuing to go on. One of the drivers that we met, a comment he made will always stick with me, and it said, he said, you know, when my kids play and they leave their toys, I ask them to clean up their mess, and he was speaking specifically to Lao with the UXO or landmine issue, but he said, you know, you guys came and made a mess, now clean it up. That's all we're asking, is for somebody to come and clean this mess up that you left. And when I say we, you think it's an American issue, but what I've since learned is that Agent Orange was actually manufactured in Elmira. Creepy enough that I work there now. So very long history, and I could go on for a day about that. But Canadians profited from the manufacturing of and distributed knowingly what this chemical was doing across the world to people we don't know. We don't know their faces. We don't know their names. And we participated and financially benefited. So that is our time. But if anyone had any quick questions, or Fred has, sorry. And if so, you know where to find us. You're welcome to have any conversations after.
The one American that was interviewed in that little video clip was Max Ediger. He started with MCC in about 1967. He was a conscientious objector, and he decided to serve in Vietnam, and he stayed. He's been living, and he was one of the 4 MCC volunteers who decided to stay after the communist government took over in 1975. There was Earl Martin, James Clausen, Max Ediger, and a volunteer from Ishigara from Japan. And they were not harmed at all, but the Vietnamese government then said, I think it's time for you to go. We have to start by ourselves. So.
This is a question about what the infrastructure in Vietnam is like, that there is not any kind of medical assistance or...
That was something that was really quite surprising to me. I'm used to being surrounded by a university town with lots of options for study and fields to get into. And the field of occupational therapy, or assisting those that have a variety of cognitive challenges, is not even an area of study. There are no schools, there are no occupational therapists being trained in a country that has over 5 million people who were originally exposed and the after effects of it. And so that MCC is actively recruiting occupational therapists to go and support the vulva center that they started, because people are coming. It's a place that's safe for the children to go. The children could be 40, could be 50. They can go, that the parents can continue to work to make an income, because if you're providing full-time hands-on care to an adult that can't care for themselves, it's very hard to earn an income. So that was my takeaway from that, is encouraging anyone that you know in that field that wants to serve to. It's tough, language is tough. Yeah, the infrastructure, just the power lines and the volume of people, and there's an area that we visited that is slightly bigger than Waterloo Region, and there's 8 million people that live there. And I think we just topped 600,000. So just seeing that, Joline got smacked in the leg with a dead pig on the back of a motorbike when we were standing in the street. It just kind of came by and whack, so things are nice and tight, and we were just like, pretty sure that was a dead pig, but anyway. We have a lot of stories on that end, but we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time. I don't want to keep you if you have other commitments, but again, we are around.